All throughout history, the people of God have struggled to ask, where is God in the midst of my pain? Where is God in the midst of all of this suffering that I experience all around me? Thankfully, the Bible is full of stories of people who find themselves in the midst of these very circumstances. And yet the message we hear consistently, time and time again, is that God is not blind to the problems that we face. God is not deaf to our cries that we voice. But rather, God is the one who sees it all, and He is a God who knows. The Hebrew word for know is yada. And the text tells us, time and time again, that God is a God who knows. We see this play out in the beginning of the book of Exodus. In many ways, Exodus begins like Genesis ended. The people of Israel, that is of Jacob, all of his 12 sons and their descendants make their way down into Egypt. And we realize that the story and the promise that we found in the book of Genesis are now continuing into the book of Exodus. And so the men in Exodus chapter 1, verse 2 are listed in order of their birth and according to the wife of Jacob. But then we get to verse 6. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. And so the story of Genesis is now essentially coming to a close. But then, verse 7. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. In other words, the mandate from Genesis 1 that they be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth is finally coming to fruition. They are finally fulfilling what God had asked His people to do. And so, what we experience in the first several verses of the book of Exodus is this God-ordained increase. They grow in numbers. They grow larger in the area that they're taking over. And so this leads, in fact, to what happens in the next verse. And so verse 8, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He probably did not acknowledge him or respect him, but it's possible that he didn't even really know who he was at all. And now the people of Israel are foreigners in a foreign land whose king does not honor foreigners. This is a difficult situation for them. And so the king makes a decision. Behold, he says, verse 9, the people are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. I actually think maybe this last part is better translated, and overtake the land. In other words, I don't think Pharaoh's that concerned that they're going to escape. I think he's more concerned that if war breaks out, they will fight with their enemies and end up taking over all of the land of Egypt. And so he makes a decision. Let's force them into labor. Let's move them from their traditional role of being shepherds and nomads into being that of forced builders. And so he starts to afflict them. They set taskmasters over them. They afflicted them with heavy burdens. They built these store cities for Pharaoh. And even though this oppression was likely intended to reduce the population, the very opposite happened. They continued to grow and flourish, even in the face of persecution. It doesn't work. They, in fact, it says in verse 12, have even more. We could call it even a population explosion. And so, even though their increase led to oppression, the reality is they are still growing. They are still increasing. However, the extent of the persecution grows even more intense. And so, verse 13, they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves. They made their lives bitter and with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. And all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. This emphasizes, I think, the intensity of the labor that they're forcing them into. now verses 15 and following, we read about the story of the midwives. And so Pharaoh has a new plan. If I can't control the population by increasing their labor or increasing the work that they're having to do, I'll control the population by controlling their birth numbers. And so he tells the midwives, tell you what, when the Israelite women are giving birth, if it's a boy, kill him. And if it's a female, you will let her live. And so the idea is to take these women who have been employed to save life, the life of the child and the life of the mother, to take them and convince them that now they need to take life. And in reality, this never was going to work. And the midwives, the text says, they feared God and they refused to do what Pharaoh had asked. Well, it seems like probably several years go by and Pharaoh realizes there's not any less Hebrew boys than there were before. There's just the same number of Hebrew boys as there are Hebrew girls. And so he calls the midwives angrily and he says, why didn't you do what I said? And they say, well, it's because the Hebrew women are vigorous. They give birth before we even get there. I'm not sure this is true. I think the reality is they were so concerned about protecting life that they refused to enact the will of Pharaoh. And so through this, we see that God is even working in the plight of the midwives. God knows and he works in order to accomplish his purposes. The story continues then in chapter 2 with the birth of God's deliverer. It says that there was a certain man and a certain woman who came together and started a family. And as the text goes on, it doesn't give any names, right? It's all sort of anonymous as we move through the story about this beautiful boy who was born. And when they could hide him no longer, they decided to do something about it. You see, Pharaoh had issued a command that all boys must be thrown into the Nile River and drowned, apparently. And so here the woman knows she's not going to be able to hide this infant for much longer. He's gotten to a stage where he's hard to keep quiet. And so what she does is she builds for him a basket. The text actually says ark. It's the same word for what Noah built. This one's significantly smaller. And she puts the baby inside of the ark, and then she actually obeys Pharaoh's command. She takes that and she puts it into the river. She places her baby into the Nile, just maybe not the way that Pharaoh had imagined. And then his sister stands far off to see what exactly will be done to the baby, what will happen to him. And yet, as Pharaoh's daughter comes down to bathe, it just so happens she's in the same place where this baby has been set. And so she sees it and she brings the basket over and she opens it and she sees him that he's crying. She realizes he's one of the Hebrew boys, and the sister of the boy comes running up and says, would you like for me to find for you someone who can nurse him and take care of him? And in this moment, the question, the fate of the future of the people rests in Pharaoh's daughter's hands. And she says to the young girl, go. And with this move, she essentially adopts this baby as her own. She lets him be nursed in the house of his own mother until he reaches an age where he is weaned. And then he comes and lives in Pharaoh's household and grows up as one of his own. However, as Pharaoh raises him in his household, word gets to Moses, this boy, whose name we discover. Word gets to this Moses that he actually came from the Hebrews. These are his people. And so one day, as Moses is older and is out walking around, he sees an Egyptian beating one of his own people, a Hebrew slave. And his anger gets the best of him, just like his ancestor Levi, who slaughtered so many at Shechem. His anger gets the best of him, and he strikes the Egyptian, and he kills him. He tries to cover the evidence in the sand, but it becomes apparent rather quickly that this thing is known. And so Pharaoh tries to take the life of Moses, and Moses flees out into Midian. And we begin to wonder, what is God up to? How is God ever going to rescue his people? Because even there in Midian, as Moses spends the next 40 years in the wilderness there, taking care of his father-in-law's flock, starting a family of his own, he remembers with bitterness the situation that he came from. In fact, he names his son, much like we saw in Genesis, he names his son after his pain. I am a sojourner there. Gershom is what he says. And so we get to the end of Exodus chapter 2, and we read these words about the summary of the situation there in the land of Egypt. It says that God looked on the people, and God saw that the cries and sufferings of all of the people came up before God, and it says, and God saw, and God knew. Some translations want to provide something else. So a translation like the NIV, I think, says, and God knew about their suffering, or God knew about it, or God knew something about it. But the reality is there is no object in the Hebrew. It's just, and God knew. And I think that's actually what the writer meant to say. It's not that there was any one thing that God knew, that there was any one specific situation that God had in mind, but God, the omniscient one, knew the whole of the situation. He saw and he knew. And so then he's going to do something about it. Exodus chapter 3. God chooses now to intervene in history in order to help bring his word and his purpose to fruition among his people. We saw something similar, right, with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob and with Joseph and the dreams. And now, once again, he's going to do this with Moses. And so he sets a bush on fire on the top of a mountain, and yet it doesn't burn up. And so Moses, as he's going along and shepherding his father-in-law's flocks, sees this bush and he comes closer, and then a voice speaks to him, come closer, but take off your shoes because the land where you are standing is holy ground. This is the first time since Eden that God has taken up sacred space. This place has become, in fact, holy ground. And I think at this point, it's helpful for us to realize what the book of Exodus is in many ways about. You see, the book of Exodus starts with the people of God increasing in the land, but then experiencing incredible oppression. And we may wonder, where is God? Where is God in the midst of all of this? He seems aloof, or like he's standing off somewhere and not paying attention to the people's pain. And yet, as we move through the book of Exodus, what we see is God making a change in the way that he's acting with his people and the way that he's responding to them. And where does the book of Exodus end? Chapter 40. We find his presence coming and dwelling in the tabernacle that they have built for him in the wilderness. In other words, God's presence comes and lives among his people. Exodus begins with God maybe nowhere to be seen, but it ends with him right in the people's midst. And I think in many ways this is a theme of Exodus, of God's presence moving in, becoming more real, more tangible among the people. Exodus chapter 3 in the burning bush, I think, is one of the clearest moments where God begins to take this first step, establishing this sacred space and saying, this is just a small piece of what I plan to do in your midst in the days and the years to come. And so he calls Moses. He asks him to go to Pharaoh. Of course, Moses, being on the run for the past 40 years, is not excited about going back into the land of slavery and facing these people once again. And yet God is persistent. I will be with you, he says. Tell the people that I am the God who has looked on them and has seen their suffering. I know what they have gone through. I know what they have experienced. And I am going to do something about it. And so, even though Moses resists time and time again, God chooses to repeat once again his invitation. Please go, go, go. Finally, Moses throws up his hands and says, Lord, please send someone else. And then God in anger says, I'll let your brother Aaron go with you, but you're still going to go. And I want you to say to Pharaoh, let my people go. And so, Moses agrees. He takes off and he heads back to Pharaoh. In essence, this is the way that chapter 4 ends, with Moses on his way back to Pharaoh in order that he might enact this deliverance for the people by God. And as the story gets ready to unfold in some of the most famous texts of all of the Old Testament, I think it's important for us to pause and recognize that even though the people are in the midst of suffering and pain, God has chosen to act. Sometimes, even in your life, you may feel as if no one is watching. No one realizes the extent of your pain or the depth of suffering in your heart. And yet God is the one who always sees. He is the one who always knows. And because He knows, He acts.